Part 1, The Hollow That Never Slept. By 1888, the small town of Briar Hollow, Georgia, had been nearly forgotten by every mapmaker. The railroad bypassed it. The crops had long since turned to dust. Yet the church on the hill, the old whitewashed chapel of St. Hallow's Rest, still stood, its bell silent for nearly 30 years. Locals said the congregation that once worshipped there never truly left. Not because they were faithful, but because they were still waiting. The townsfolk avoided the hill after sunset. For those who wandered too close claimed to hear hymns drifting through the pine trees, voices layered and wrong, like a choir singing through water. Some swore the bell rang on nights when no wind blew, tolling 13 times before silence fell again. It was in that same fading year when a young preacher named Elias Ward came to Briar Hollow, sent by the diocese to restore what remained of St. Hallow's. Elias was no stranger to decay. He had buried half his own congregation back in Savannah during the fever years, but something about the hollow drew him. The townsfolk warned him in hushed voices not to stay past dusk, that the church was claimed, that those who entered after dark heard their own names spoken back to them from the rafters. Elias smiled, polite but firm. Faith, he said, was stronger than superstition. He climbed the hill alone that evening, Bible in hand, his lantern trembling in the wind. Inside, the church smelled of rot and cold candle wax. The pews were coated with decades of dust. Yet the altar was clean, polished, untouched by time. As he knelt to pray, a faint warmth flickered through the air, like the memory of sunlight. He felt it before he heard it, a soft hum, low and harmonic, coming from beneath the floorboards. Elias froze. The sound grew stronger, layered like voices joining one by one in an unseen choir. His lantern dimmed, the flame shrinking to a pin of light. Then a voice whispered just behind his ear, a woman's, clear and close. "You're late for service." Elias turned, but the church was empty. The air smelled suddenly of lilacs, old perfume, the kind worn by southern women long dead. The choir swelled, and the pews creaked as though invisible bodies had taken their places. Through the cracked stained glass, moonlight painted their shapes, outlines of heads bowed in prayer, shoulders swaying in rhythm. Elias' knees trembled. He clutched his Bible tighter, whispering verses under his breath. The hum shifted, soft at first, then rising into a melody he almost recognized, the hymn of redemption, though the words were all wrong. "Blessed are the hollow, for they shall be filled." The bell tower groaned and a single toll shook the chapel. Elias flinched. Dust fell from the rafters. He stumbled toward the door, but it refused to open. No latch, no give, as if the wood itself wanted him to stay. The voices grew louder now, surrounding him in perfect harmony, and for one disorienting moment he felt calm. An impossible, serene peace, as if every wound in his heart had been stitched shut. He almost smiled. Then he saw them. Reflections. Not in glass or mirror, but in the air itself. Faint shapes of faces, eyeless, mouths open in eternal song. The choir of St. Hallow's Rest, their lips moving without breath. Elias screamed a prayer and threw his lantern. The glass shattered, and flames spread across the wooden floor, but instead of smoke, a wave of cold air burst upward, extinguishing everything. The church fell silent. The air pressed against him, heavy and watching. Then the same woman's voice whispered again, softer this time. "You can't burn what's already blessed." When he stumbled out of the church moments later, the dawn was breaking. He turned to look back, expecting smoke, flame, anything, but the chapel stood perfectly untouched, its windows clear, its paint fresh as though restored overnight. The bell tolled once more, a sound so low it rattled his chest. And beneath that single note, Elias heard the truth in their hymn. The church had not been abandoned. It had been fed. And now it was awake again. Part 2, The Choir That Hungered for Souls. Elias Ward didn't sleep that night. He sat by the window of the inn, watching the faint orange glow on the horizon, listening for the echo of the bell. The innkeeper, an old woman named Mrs. Thorne, brought him tea and whispered a single warning before leaving: "The hollow church doesn't sing for the living." Elias tried to pray, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw those hollow faces, their mouths wide, frozen mid him. When morning came, he climbed the hill again, determined to prove to himself that it had all been an illusion born of exhaustion. Yet the moment he opened the church doors, he knew it hadn't been. The pews were no longer covered in dust. Candles burned along the aisle, though none had been lit by human hands. The air shimmered faintly, as if the morning sunlight itself bent to avoid the altar. The hymn book he'd left behind on the podium had changed, the pages filled with strange symbols written in ash. They pulsed faintly as though breathing. And in the silence, Elias heard something new, the soft, steady rhythm of children's laughter. He followed the sound to the back of the church, to the narrow staircase leading down to the crypt. Each step creaked like a heartbeat. The deeper he went, the colder it grew, until his breath fogged in front of him. At the bottom, the light from his lantern caught something carved into the stone wall. Names? Hundreds of them, etched in uneven lines, many overlapping. He touched one at random and drew his hand back instantly. The stone felt warm. Beneath the list, a single line had been freshly carved, as though waiting for him: Elias Ward, Choir of Hollow. He stumbled back, heart hammering. A sound rose from the darkness, not laughter this time, but humming. Dozens of voices in unison. He turned his lantern toward the sound, and for a split second he saw them. Translucent shapes of children standing shoulder to shoulder, their eyes black as soot, their mouths moving to the same haunting rhythm. They watched him without blinking, their heads swaying side to side, matching the tempo of some silent, ancient hymn. "Who are you?" he whispered. The closest child smiled faintly and pointed upward. "We sing for him." The voice wasn't a child's. It was deep, layered, distorted. "He feeds when we sing. You will feed too." Elias stumbled back toward the stairs, but the steps were gone, replaced by an unbroken wall of stone. Panic clawed through him. He turned again, but the children were closer now, their faces flickering between human and hollow. He pressed himself against the wall, closing his eyes, reciting verses under his breath. "Deliver us from evil, deliver us from evil, deliver us." The air shifted. Silence fell. When he opened his eyes, the crypt was empty again. The wall behind him had returned to steps. Shaking, he climbed upward, gasping as daylight struck his face. But something was wrong. The sun was higher than it should have been. A whole day had passed. He staggered down the hill and back into the town square, where Mrs. Thorne waited with others. The look on their faces told him everything. They'd buried someone that morning. A boy no older than 10. Found at the base of the church steps. Eyes open, mouth stretched in a silent scream. Elias felt his stomach twist. When the undertaker lifted the boy's sleeve, Elias saw the faint black mark on his wrist, a small circle drawn in ash. The same symbol from the hymn book. The townsfolk murmured, afraid to speak the truth. But Mrs. Thorne said it anyway, her voice trembling. "The church has started singing again." That night, Elias locked himself inside his room and tore through his Bible, searching for meaning. His hands shook as he turned the pages. When he reached the final one, something stopped him cold. A single slip of paper had been wedged there. It wasn't his. The writing was unfamiliar, looping and graceful. "The choir hungers. The priest will lead." The candles in his room flickered once, then died. And somewhere, faintly through the still night air, he heard it again, the distant hum of the hollow church rising in song. Part 3, The Pastor Who Never Left. The next morning, Elias returned to the hollow church with the letter still trembling in his hands. The fog was thick, curling around the gravestones like fingers dragging across the earth. He wasn't sure why he came back, perhaps guilt, perhaps faith, but part of him believed there had to be a reason for it all. The church stood silent under the gray sky, its door ajar as if expecting him. When he stepped inside, the world seemed to hush. Dust hung motionless in the air. The pews were empty, and yet the faint echo of footsteps followed him down the aisle. He moved toward the pulpit and saw something new upon it, a portrait frame draped in cobwebs. He wiped it clean with his sleeve and froze. It was a painting of a man in priestly robes, his expression calm, eyes eerily alive. Below it, the brass plate read, Reverend Alaric Horn, 1839 to 1871. Elias felt a chill crawl through him. According to the town records, Horn had been the church's last pastor, the one who'd vanished when the congregation fell ill 2 decades ago. Elias leaned closer, and for a moment, he could have sworn the eyes in the painting shifted toward him. The Bible that sat beside the frame was wrong, its cover stitched in black leather that felt almost soft to the touch. He opened it, and the pages inside were filled not with scripture, but names, thousands of them, each written in what looked like dried blood. The last few entries were dated that very week. His own name appeared on the final line. Elias's breath caught. He stumbled backward as a voice rose from behind the pulpit, soft and familiar. "Faith requires offering, Brother Ward." He turned, heart hammering, and there stood Reverend Horn, just as he appeared in the painting, robes perfectly pressed, eyes burning like candle flames in an unlit room. Elias couldn't speak. Horn smiled faintly, hands folded in prayer. "You came seeking truth," he said. "Truth must be fed." His voice was layered, like a chorus whispering in harmony behind his words. They called us cursed, Elias. But we were chosen. He gestured to the altar, where faint outlines of figures began to appear, shimmering, translucent, kneeling in devotion. Elias realized with horror that the congregation was still here. Every seat filled with the ghosts of the faithful, mouths open in silent praise. The choir stood at the front, their faces indistinct blurs of motion. They sing to keep him listening, Horn murmured. If the singing stops, he hungers. And when he hungers, he takes. Elias tried to run, but the doors slammed shut. The air turned thick, pressing against his chest. The candles burned blue, their light casting twisted shadows that moved on their own. Horn stepped closer, reaching out a hand that flickered between flesh and ash. You heard the hymn, he said softly. You're already his. Elias backed away, shouting prayers, but his voice was drowned out by the rising hum of the choir. The ghosts began to sing, not in melody but in a long, trembling wail that vibrated through the wooden floorboards. Elias clutched his cross and fell to his knees, his vision blurring as the sound filled every corner of his mind. He felt something cold brush his shoulder, fingers that left behind the scent of decay. The hymn shifted, words forming in a language he didn't know, yet somehow understood. They weren't worshiping God. They were calling something else. Suddenly the music stopped. Silence. When Elias looked up, Reverend Horn was gone. The pews were empty again. Only the portrait remained, but now, in the painted background, Elias could see faint new figures, shadowy outlines of faces among the congregation. One of them looked like his own. He stumbled out of the church and fell to his knees in the dirt, gasping for air. The wind carried the sound of faint singing behind him. When he turned, the church's windows glowed softly as if lit from within. But there was no light inside, only movement. Dozens of hands pressed against the glass, reaching outward. That night, back at the inn, Elias wrote everything down. His final note read, "The pastor never left. None of them did. The church lives as long as someone listens." Then, beneath it, in shaky handwriting not his own, appeared a single line that hadn't been there before, Amen. Part 4, The Communion of Shadows. By the time Elias returned to the Hollow Church for the fourth and final time, the entire town of Wraiths Hollow seemed to have changed. The streets were empty, the lamps unlit, and the silence was so absolute that even the crickets refused to sing. The fog had thickened into something solid, a slow-moving wall that swallowed the horizon. The inn where Mrs. Thorne once stood was abandoned, her sign swinging in the wind like a hanged thing. Elias felt an ache deep in his bones, a pull as though invisible strings drew him back toward the church on the hill. As he approached, he saw figures standing in the mist, silhouettes in prayer facing the chapel doors. Men, women, even children. Their forms flickered faintly like candlelight. When he tried to speak to them, they did not respond. They were humming that same dreadful hymn, lips moving in perfect unison. Elias pushed through them, each figure dissolving into dust as he passed. The church loomed ahead, its doors wide open, revealing only darkness inside. The bell tower groaned and the old rope swayed gently, though there was no wind. He stepped across the threshold, and the sound of the outside world vanished entirely. The doors shut behind him with a low, final thud. Inside, the pews were gone. The altar was surrounded by a circle of lit candles that burned black instead of gold. Reverend Horn stood at the center, holding a chalice carved from bone. Around him knelt the congregation, or what was left of them, their faces half gone, their skin melting into mist. "Welcome home, Brother Ward," Horn said, his voice echoing from every direction. "You've seen what faith truly costs. Will you drink?" Elias tried to speak, but his voice caught in his throat. "What are you?" he managed to whisper. Horn smiled, a terrible, saintly smile. "We are what remains when belief outlives God." He raised the chalice toward the air above him, and the shadows on the ceiling began to move, not like smoke but like limbs. They coiled downward, wrapping around him and the congregation. The ground trembled. The hymn began again, louder than ever, a symphony of agony and worship combined. The faces of the wraiths turned toward Elias, mouths open in prayer, their voices merging into one unbearable cry. The candles flared. Elias fell to his knees, covering his ears, but the song wasn't heard, it was felt, vibrating through his heart like a pulse. The shadows reached for him, brushing against his face, whispering his name in 1,000 broken tones. "You came to witness," they murmured. "Now you belong." Horn stepped closer, his face flickering between man and something vast and hollow. "This is the communion," he said softly. "Faith is not a gift, Elias. It is a hunger, and we are its meal." He pressed the chalice into Elias's hands. Inside it was something thick and dark, neither blood nor wine, but something that moved on its own. "Drink," Horn commanded. Elias closed his eyes, trembling. He remembered his prayers, his years of faith, his search for proof that something divine still lingered in this forsaken place. Now he had found it, and it was consuming him. The hymn grew deafening, and before he could think, the liquid touched his lips. Instantly the world shattered. He saw visions of the congregation's final night, when the people of Wraiths Hollow gathered to pray for salvation from a plague that never existed. They'd sung, desperate, believing their faith would save them. But Horn's voice had changed the hymn, twisting it into an invocation. Something inhuman had answered. The air turned black. Flesh melted. Soul screamed. And when the smoke cleared, only the Wraiths remained, bound forever to the church, their devotion eternal. Elias gasped, dropping the chalice. The black flame extinguished, plunging everything into darkness. He stumbled toward the door, but when he turned back, Horn was gone, replaced by the flickering figure of himself, standing at the altar, holding the chalice once more. The realization hit him like ice. He was now the priest. The congregation was kneeling before him. And the hymn began again. He tried to scream, but his voice joined theirs instead. His words melted into the song, and his body faded into the shadows that fed on sound and faith alike. Outside, the fog lifted slightly, revealing the church glowing faintly in the distance. A traveler passing through the next morning swore he heard a choir singing in perfect harmony, soft, beautiful, and wrong. And if one listened closely beneath the melody, a new voice could be heard leading them. A voice that once belonged to Elias Ward. Part 5, The Church That Never Died. By dawn, Wraiths Hollow was gone. Where the town once stood, only the faint skeletons of buildings remained, outlines in ash devoured by mist. The hollow church, however, stood untouched atop its hill, silent and waiting. No one dared approach it for decades. The locals called it cursed ground. Travelers claimed to see candlelight in its windows, or to hear faint hymns carried by the wind at midnight. But no one who ventured inside was ever seen again. In 1923, a team of historians from Atlanta arrived to document what they called the last surviving church of early Georgian architecture. They brought cameras, notebooks, and a deep skepticism of all local superstition. On the third night of their stay, the leader, Professor James Harker, decided to enter the church alone. He recorded his steps in his journal, no signs of recent entry. The floorboards seem newer than the exterior suggests. "I hear faint singing?" It was his last entry. When his team found the journal days later, the church doors were sealed shut from the inside, and the building felt warm, unnaturally so, as if something within it was breathing. They broke the lock and entered. What they found was not decay but life, candles burning freshly, pews cleaned, hymnals open as if waiting for a congregation that had just stepped out. In the center aisle stood a figure in black robes, unmoving. When they approached, the man turned slowly. His face was pale and expressionless, but his eyes were alive. "Service begins soon," he said calmly, though no one else was there. The team fled in panic, but one of their recorders continued rolling. On playback, the tape revealed not silence, but the sound of hundreds of voices singing in perfect harmony. A church choir, flawless and ancient, their words echoing through layers of static. Near the end of the tape, a second voice whispered beneath the chorus, faint but clear, "Faith must be fed." Over the years, the church became a forbidden subject in local records. Officials labeled it historically unstable ground, and maps quietly erased its location. Yet strange reports continued. A hiker found a cross carved into a nearby tree, freshly cut, though the bark was centuries old. A mail carrier swore he saw candlelight in the fog, and the faint outline of a man standing by the church door, beckoning. Others spoke of hearing organ music from miles away, a tune that seemed to hum through their bones long after it stopped. By the 1950s, even the nearby forest began to thin. Trees wilted without reason. Animals avoided the area. But every once in a while, a storm would pass through and lightning would illuminate the old hill, and for a brief moment people could see them, silhouettes through the stained glass windows, singing in unison. Always singing. In 1978, a film crew attempted to document the legend for a local television series called Forgotten Faiths of the South. The footage was never aired. What little was recovered showed an empty church interior, until frame by frame, faint outlines began to appear. Figures in robes. Hands lifted in prayer. A chalice raised high. And finally, just before the reel burned out, the camera panned across the pulpit, where the inscription read, Reverend Elias Ward. Today, locals say the hollow church still stands, though no one can ever quite find it twice. Travelers who wander too deep into the Georgia fog sometimes claim they hear a choir in the distance. Soft, mournful, impossibly old. And if they follow the sound, they say it feels as if the air itself is pulling them closer, step by step, until the mist parts and the faint glow of candlelight appears through the trees. No one knows what happens next, but those who've heard the hymn say it stays with them forever. It hums beneath the heart like a second pulse. And when they close their eyes at night, they swear they can see pews stretching endlessly into the dark, 1,000 empty seats waiting to be filled. And at the front, beneath a shattered crucifix, stands a man in black robes, face half hidden, chalice in hand, whispering almost tenderly. The congregation awaits.